The sterile scent of antiseptic and the low whir of the dental drill were a familiar, almost comforting, soundtrack to my life. I used to think that people in their mid-30s had their lives neatly figured out, their careers established, relationships settled. I certainly thought I did. My colleagues, friends, the men I'd dated, they all seemed to be on a well-defined path, focused on promotions or settling down, or so it seemed. Then, 34-year-old me met Dr. Ethan Hayes, and that neat little picture began to blur. It was a Tuesday morning appointment, the kind I'd been putting off for months, and the waiting room was a stark contrast to the frantic pace of my life. Everything about Dr. Hayes seemed precise and composed, his crisp white coat, his neatly trimmed light brown hair, the way he moved with a quiet efficiency. It wasn't until I was reclined in the chair, the bright dental light blinding me, that I noticed something more. He was examining my teeth with the practiced ease of someone who had done it countless times. When our eyes met, the brief connection wasn't awkward, it was like a silent acknowledgement. He had a warm, almost disarming smile that lingered a little longer than professional protocol dictated. At first, I didn't think much of it. Just a friendly gesture on a busy day, but something about the way his gaze held mine, the faint smile playing on his lips, stuck with me. It wasn't just politeness, it was a spark. For the next half hour, I found myself stealing glances at him, when he wasn't hovering over my teeth. Sometimes he was adjusting the tools, sometimes he was charting notes, and his movements were precise and graceful. The longer I observed him, the more I was drawn to his focused intensity. There was something intriguing about his calm demeanor and the subtle concentration he carried. As the bright light beamed down on me, it somehow felt like the most private conversation I could be having. I noticed him again as he moved to a different tool. He seemed to hesitate before picking it up, and for a moment his eyes met mine, and there was a flicker, a shared understanding, a silent question. Instead of looking away, I decided to act. "Excuse me," I mumbled, my voice slightly muffled by the dental bib. He paused, his expression surprised. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice low and smooth. "I was just wondering, is it always this thorough?" I asked, trying to sound casual, my cheeks flushing. He smiled, a real smile that made the corners of his eyes crinkle. "I like to make sure I cover everything," he replied, "but I can certainly be persuaded to be less thorough if it's too much." His tone was teasing but warm. "Please," I offered with a grin. He laughed quietly, the sound light and genuine. "All right," he said, making an adjustment to the light and a motion to another tool, "but you might have to distract me more." As he leaned over to start again, I felt a small spark, as if we had somehow stumbled into a shared joke. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, it was charged, as if we both knew there was more to this than a routine dental appointment. I finally broke the quiet. "Long day?" I asked, nodding towards the dental light. He chuckled, a low sound that was laced with a hint of exhaustion. "It is," he agreed, "but I try to keep the atmosphere calm." "I try to be a good patient," I said, a smile playing on my lips. "You are," he said, his eyes searching mine. "You're the first person to ask if I'm too thorough with such charm." His words hung in the air, heavy and unfiltered. I wasn't sure what to say, so I stayed quiet, letting him continue if he wanted. "I've been doing this for a few years," he added after a moment, "and sometimes it all starts to feel the same." "I think everyone feels that way at some point," I said finally, my voice soft. "We get so caught up in what we do that we forget to ask what we really, really want." Ethan turned to look at me, his eyes searching mine for a moment. I wondered if I'd said too much, but then he nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You're perceptive for someone so quiet," he said, his tone teasing but warm. I laughed lightly, shaking my head. "Or maybe I just see what you're projecting." That made him laugh, a deep, genuine sound that seemed to fill the small room. It was the first time I'd seen him let go of the weight he carried, even if only for a moment. It felt like a small victory. As he continued the examination, we spoke, or rather, we found reasons to talk, lingering on questions about the best toothpaste or discussing the dreaded mouthguard I probably needed. We talked about our lives. His in this quiet little dental practice, mine in my busy marketing job. The books we were reading, our dreams for the future. The more we talked, the more I realized how much I enjoyed his company. There was something comforting about his presence, like a quiet refuge in the middle of a storm. Eventually the conversation slowed and we settled into a companionable silence, his movements precise and gentle. I could feel his gaze shift to me every now and then, but I didn't turn to meet it, not yet. There was something unspoken in the air between us, something fragile and undefined, and I wasn't ready to break it. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's been a long time since I felt this, at ease," he said, his words catching me off guard. I turned to look at him, his expression open, vulnerable, in a way I hadn't expected. "You don't have to thank me," I said softly. "I'm glad I came in." For a moment, we just looked at each other. The quiet intimacy of the moment settling around us. It wasn't a grand gesture or a sudden revelation, it was a connection. Simple, profound, that neither of us had anticipated. As the appointment wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something. Something neither of us fully understood yet, and I can tell you, the beginning it was. This was only the kickoff of something I could never have imagined, not even in my wildest dreams. The minutes after that first conversation felt different. It wasn't as though anything monumental had changed, but there was a new layer to the appointment. I found myself looking around for Dr. Hayes more often, hoping to catch a glimpse of him near the sink or by the computer. When our eyes inevitably met, it felt like an unspoken invitation. It didn't take long for those glances to become more intense. A nod from him or a slight smile from me was all it took, and I'd find myself leaning forward, drawn to his quiet presence. There was a rhythm to our interactions, a flow that made the minutes slip by unnoticed. He spoke with a calm confidence, his words measured but meaningful. I began to understand the depth of his thoughts, the way he carried years of experience with a mixture of pride and quiet resilience. One moment, as he was showing me a sample of the mouthguard, he invited me to look closer at the small back office. "I realize I've been sticking pretty close to the chair," he said with a smile. "Come, let me show you where the most interesting X-rays are kept." I hesitated, surprised by the sudden shift, but his easy demeanor put me at ease. "Sure," I said, following him to the back of the office, past the supply cabinets, to a small private area. Inside was exactly as I imagined, neat, understated, and practical. There was a faint scent of antiseptic and coffee lingering in the air, mixing with the faint traces of cologne that clung to him. It felt lived in, comfortable, a stark contrast to the often sterile atmosphere of the front office. "Coffee?" he asked, gesturing towards a small portable coffee machine. "Why not?" I replied, settling onto a small stool. He poured 2 cups, the dark liquid steaming as he handed one to me. "To good teeth," he said, raising his cup. "To good teeth," I echoed, clinking my cup against his. The first sip was smooth and warming, a perfect match for the intimacy of the small space. Ethan took a seat opposite me, his posture relaxed but his gaze sharp. He watched me for a moment, as if weighing his words, before speaking. "You know," he began, "I wasn't sure about you at first." I raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Oh. You're observant. And you're quiet. Most people don't bother looking past the surface." His words caught me off guard and I found myself searching for a response. "Maybe I just know what it's like to feel unseen," I said quietly. "It makes you notice things in others." Ethan's gaze softened, his expression thoughtful. "You're a good listener," he said. "It's rare to find someone who listens without trying to fix or judge." There was a weight to his words, a sincerity that made my chest tighten. I wasn't sure where this was going, but something in his eyes told me he wanted me to know something about him. I think sometimes people just need to be heard, I said simply. He nodded, his eyes distant for a moment before returning to mine. You're right. And it's been a long time since I felt heard. The vulnerability in his voice was palpable and it tugged at something deep within me. I wanted to tell him that he deserved to be heard, that his thoughts and feelings mattered, but the words felt too heavy to say aloud. Instead, I offered him a small smile, letting the silence fill the space between us. As the appointment wore on, our conversation drifted to more personal topics. He shared stories of his early struggles to set up the practice and about his dreams of volunteering with underserved communities. I shared bits of my life, too. How I'd moved to this city for work a few years ago, my loneliness and my own struggles with finding my place in the world. The more we talked, the more I realized that we had a lot more in common than I had first anticipated. At one point, he leaned back in his chair, his cup resting on the small table. It's funny, he said, his voice tinged with nostalgia, when you're young, you think the world is your oyster, but then life hits you and you don't know what to do next. I nodded, understanding the sentiment, even though my experience was so different from his. Do you ever feel like you missed something? I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. He considered this for a moment, his gaze fixed on the floor. Sometimes, he admitted, but I try not to dwell on it. Regret doesn't change the past. His honesty was disarming and I felt a sudden urge to share something of my own. I think everyone has those moments, I said. I'm only 34 and I already catch myself wondering if I'm on the right path. Ethan looked at me, his expression soft but serious. You've got time, he said, more than you realize. Don't let fear stop you from living. His words stayed with me long after I left the small office. There was a wisdom in them, a perspective I hadn't considered before. And something more was still coming. I could feel it. The way he had looked at me, the way he had spoken to me. It was as if he desired me, and it drove me crazy, as something in me desired him too. As I sat back in the dental chair, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that Ethan and I had crossed an invisible line. It wasn't just about casual conversations. There was a connection between us, something unspoken but undeniable. Over the next hour, I found myself drawn to him even more. I'd catch glimpses of him doing his duties, and my heart would quicken in a way I couldn't explain. There was a warmth in his presence, a comfort that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't before. As much as I tried to tell myself that it was just a friendly connection, a part of me wondered if it was something more. One moment, as the appointment was nearing its end, I found myself back in the small office, another sample of toothpaste in hand. The air was warm and still, the faint scent of antiseptic lingering around us. We sat in a companionable silence for a while, the sounds of the office a distant hum. Finally, Ethan spoke, his voice low and measured. You know, he said, I never thought I'd find myself here, sharing coffee with a patient and talking about life. It's nice, I smiled. The sincerity in his words warming me more than the coffee. I feel the same way, I admitted. It's easy to talk to you. He turned to look at me, his gaze lingering for a moment. I thought he might say something more, but he simply nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was charged, as though we were both waiting for something neither of us could name. In that quiet moment, beneath the harsh fluorescent light, I realized just how much Ethan had come to mean to me. He was not just a dentist, he was so much more. I could just feel it. In some way, I was very attracted to him and I wasn't sure yet, but I think he was attracted to me too. The time that followed felt like a slow dance between the ordinary and the extraordinary. Ethan and I fell into a rhythm, as if our lives had always been intertwined this way. Our casual conversation turned into longer moments together and soon it became natural for me to be seeking him out. Each time I stepped into the back office, It felt like entering a world set apart from everything else, a quiet refuge where time seemed to slow down. Ethan's presence was magnetic. He didn't need to command attention with grand gestures or flashy words. It was in the small things, the way his voice softened when he spoke of something close to his heart, the quiet hum of contentment as he refilled our cups, or the way he leaned forward slightly when he listened as though my words were the only ones that mattered. Eventually, he invited me to stay a little longer, after the appointment was officially over. It was a small gesture, but something about it felt different. There was a subtle shift in his tone, an undercurrent of anticipation that made my pulse quicken. "It's usually a bit crazy this time of day," he warned, with a self-deprecating smile as the receptionist began to wrap up for the day. "But it's always better with company." I laughed, taking in the sight of him. He wore a relaxed look, not just a professional one. The air felt charged and completely disarming. "This is a very generous offer," I said, taking a seat beside him. "I know," he replied, and shrugged. The remark hung in the air, a quiet nod to the hours he'd spent with me. I wanted to understand more, but the vulnerability in his eyes held me back. As we sat there talking, the conversation flowed as easily as ever. He shared stories of his younger days, impulsive travels and nights spent under the stars. His voice carried a mix of nostalgia and longing, as though he were reliving those moments with every word. "I used to think those were the best days of my life," he said, swirling the last of his coffee in his cup. "But now, I'm not so sure." "What do you mean?" I asked, leaning forward. He met my gaze, his expression thoughtful. "Back then, it was all about chasing the next thrill, the next high. But I think the best days are the ones where you're truly present." There was a vulnerability in his voice, where you can sit across from someone and just feel at peace. The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard and I felt a warmth spread through my chest. "I get that," I said quietly. "It's not about the big moments, is it? It's about the little ones." "Exactly," he said, his lips curving into a soft smile. "And lately, it feels like there are more of those little moments." The words hung between us, their meaning unspoken but understood. My heart raced and I felt a pull toward him that was as undeniable as it was unexpected. I wasn't sure if it was the end of a long day or the way his gaze lingered just a second too long, but something in me shifted. The dentist chair was reclined, and everything felt surreal. We remained in the back office, a lingering sense of something special hanging in the air. "This has been different," Ethan said, his voice low. "Thank you." "You don't have to thank me," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "You made it easy." He chuckled softly, the sound warm and genuine. "You make it easy too." The moment stretched between us, the silence thick with unspoken emotions. I could feel the tension in the air, the magnetic pull that seemed to draw us closer with every passing second. Then, without thinking, I reached out, letting my fingers brush against his. His hand stilled under mine, and for a moment I worried I'd crossed a line, but then he turned his hand over, his palm meeting mine, his fingers curling gently around mine. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through me, and I felt my breath hitch. "Ethan," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head, his thumb brushing against the back of my hand. "It's okay," he said softly, "you don't have to say anything." His words were both a reassurance and an invitation, and I felt my resolve crumble. The space between us seemed to shrink, and before I knew it, I was leaning closer, drawn to the warmth of his presence. When our lips finally met, it was tentative, a careful exploration of the emotions we had both been holding back. His touch was gentle but firm, his years of experience evident in the way he moved, the way he held me, as if I was something precious. It wasn't rushed or frantic, it was steady, deliberate, and filled with a depth of feeling that left me breathless. When we finally pulled apart, his forehead rested against mine, his breath warm against my skin. "I didn't think this was possible," he admitted, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Neither did I said, my voice shaky but honest, "but I'm glad it is." For the first time in a long time, I felt completely at ease, as though I'd found a place where I belonged. As I sat there, wrapped in the quiet comfort of Ethan's presence, I knew that whatever came next, I was ready to face it with him. And I knew that this was not over, it was the beginning of something bigger than I could have ever imagined. The evening carried a serene weight, as though the universe itself had paused to take a breath. Ethan and I remained in the office, the soft glow of the desk lamp casting warm shadows on his face. His eyes lingered on mine, a mix of gratitude and trepidation swimming in their depths. I could sense the hesitation in him, the years of restraint and responsibility that threatened to pull him back. "Are you okay?" I asked softly, my hand still resting in his. He nodded, exhaling slowly. "I am," he admitted. It's been a long time since I let myself feel this way." I smiled, understanding the courage it must have taken for him to admit that. "Me too," I said, though my experience with vulnerability paled in comparison to his. "But I think we deserve this, don't you?" Ethan's lips curved into a faint smile, but the weight in his eyes remained. I spent so many years convincing myself that there was only one way to live, that the roles we play, dentist, friend, roommate, define us entirely. But lately, he trailed off, his gaze drifting to the window where the street lights shone. "Lately," I prompted, leaning in slightly. "Lately, I've been wondering what else there is," he said, turning back to me. "What it might mean to choose something for myself, to feel something just because I want to." His words hung between us, heavy with meaning. I squeezed his hand gently, anchoring him to the moment. "You can," I said simply, "and you don't have to apologize for it." He closed his eyes briefly, as though absorbing the truth of my words. When he opened them again, there was a quiet determination in his gaze. "You're something else," he said, his voice low and filled with a warmth that sent a shiver through me. We sat there for a while, the silence between us filled with the kind of understanding that didn't need words. I could feel the shift in him, the way his shoulders relaxed and his grip on my hand steadied. He wasn't fighting it anymore, he was allowing himself to be present, to let the moment unfold without resistance. Then, as the receptionist knocked on the door to say goodnight, Ethan's eyes took on a different kind of intensity. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Do you want to?" He hesitated, glancing towards the small supply closet. I felt a jolt of adrenaline shoot through me. The idea was reckless, impulsive, but it was impossible to ignore the desire that was building between us. "Yes," I said, my voice just as low, "I do." He stood, tugging me gently by the hand. "Quickly," he said, leading me towards the back of the office. My heart pounded as he pushed open the closet door. The space was small, the fluorescent light harsh, but in that moment, it felt like the only place in the world where we could truly exist. I turned, and Ethan was there, his eyes dark with want. He didn't say anything, just reached for me, his hands cupping my face as he kissed me with a ferocity that matched my own. His tongue slipped between my lips, and I moaned into his mouth, my hands tangling in his hair. We fumbled in the narrow space, making everything feel more urgent. He pulled my shirt out of my pants, his fingers brushing across my skin, sending shivers down my spine. I reached for his belt, and he groaned when I undid it, his eyes never leaving mine. The lights flickered and we steadied ourselves against a shelf. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his breath hot against my ear. "More than anything," I said, my voice thick with desire. We kissed again, a deep, hungry kiss that left us both breathless. He unzipped my pants, and I did the same to his. The contact was electric, the small space amplifying every touch. I pulled him closer and he wrapped his arms around me, holding me tight against his body. We moved together, a desperate rhythm that matched the throbbing in my chest. The small space seemed to disappear, and I was lost in the sensation of him, his skin hot against mine, his breath rasping in my ear. The lights flickered again and we held each other tighter, our bodies moving in perfect sync. The intensity built, a crescendo of sensation that left us both gasping for breath. As we reached the peak, I squeezed my eyes shut, letting go of everything but the moment. We stood there, panting, our bodies pressed together, the sounds of the office a distant hum. When we finally pulled apart, it was with a sense of disbelief. Ethan started, his voice shaky. "Don't," I said, pressing a finger to his lips. "Just don't." We stayed like that for a few minutes, the small space holding our secret. Then, with a last lingering look, we straightened our clothes and stepped back into the real world. As we made our way back to the front office, I felt as if the world had shifted on its axis. I knew that whatever came next, I was ready to face it with him. And I knew that this was not over, it was the beginning of something bigger than I could have ever imagined. The morning light filtered softly through the office window, casting a golden hue over the waiting room. I woke to the quiet sounds of the office systems, my head resting against Ethan's chest, his arms still draped around me, his breathing deep and even. A peaceful rhythm that made the world feel safe. For a moment, I stayed perfectly still, savoring the tranquility of the moment. It felt like the kind of morning I'd always hoped for, simple, quiet, and filled with a sense of belonging. Eventually, Ethan stirred, his eyes fluttering open. As he looked down at me, a slow, warm smile spread across his face, and he gave a soft chuckle. "Good morning," he said, his voice still heavy with sleep. "Morning," I replied, feeling my cheeks warm under his gaze. He reached up, brushing a strand of hair from my forehead. "I can't remember the last time I woke up feeling this content," he admitted, his voice tinged with vulnerability. "Me neither," I said, smiling back at him. "This feels right." "It does," he agreed, his expression softening more than I ever expected it would. We stayed like that for a while, the weight of the world kept at bay by the stillness of the moment. There was no rush, no need to fill the silence with words. Everything we needed to say was spoken in the way we held each other, in the way his hand absent-mindedly traced circles on my arm, in the way our breaths synchronized as if our bodies had found their own rhythm together. Eventually, hunger began to creep in, and Ethan reluctantly pulled away. "I think I owe you breakfast," he said with a grin, sitting up and stretching. "You don't owe me anything," I said, following him to the small kitchen, "but I'm not going to say no to your cooking." He laughed, the sound light and free, as he rummaged through the small pantry. "How do you feel about leftover dental office snacks?" "Perfect," I replied, taking a seat on one of the jump seats. As he worked, I watched him with a sense of quiet admiration. There was something grounding about the way he moved, his actions steady and purposeful. It reminded me of why I had been drawn to him in the first place, his quiet strength, his ability to make even the simplest moments feel meaningful. When he placed the small snacks in front of me, the aroma was, well, it was dental office snacks, but it was good. "You've really outdone yourself," I said, taking a bite. The flavors were okay, just like the man who had made them. Ethan smiled, sitting across from me. "I wanted to make this morning special," he said, his tone earnest. "You did," I assured him, "more than you know." After breakfast, we found ourselves back in the office, the weight of the previous night still hanging in the air, but in a way that felt comforting rather than heavy. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant for a moment before he spoke. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "For so long, I convinced myself that part of my life was over, that it wasn't something I could have anymore." I reached out, placing a hand on his knee. "You can," I said firmly, "and you deserve to." His eyes met mine, and there was a rawness there that made my chest tighten. "It's scary," he admitted, "letting myself feel this way, letting myself want this." "I know," I said softly, "but you're not doing it alone." He nodded, his expression softening. "I don't think I could have done this without you. You've made me realize that it's okay to want more, to want something for myself." I leaned in, resting my forehead against his. And you've shown me what it means to truly connect with someone, to see them for who they are, not who they think they have to be. The moment lingered, the silence between us heavy with unspoken promises. When we finally pulled apart, it was with a sense of quiet resolution. This wasn't just a fleeting connection, it was the start of something that had the power to change us both. As the day wore on, we talked about the future, not in grand sweeping terms, but in the small meaningful ways that made all the difference. We spoke of shared dinners in the city, lazy evenings exploring local bookstores, and the kind of companionship that made even the most ordinary moment feel extraordinary. By the time the office closed, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't known was possible. Ethan sat beside me as we locked up, his hand in mine as we watched the world slow down around us. "You know," he said after a while, his voice soft. "I used to think my best days were behind me, but now I'm starting to believe they might still be ahead." I smiled, leaning my head against his shoulder. "They are," I said confidently, "and I'll be right here with you." We stayed like that, as the office lights dimmed, the weight of the past no longer feeling so heavy, and the uncertainty of the future not feeling so daunting. All that mattered was the here and now, and the quiet promise of what was to come. I still feel good about what I did, helping out a dentist. That's what we do, isn't it? Well, whatever he needs, I'm sure I'm there.